Dzień dobry from San Antonio, Texas, and various parts of the country, including New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and Houston, Texas. But Samantha and I from the World Affairs Council are coming to you from San Antonio, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us for this very not only important presentation about Poland and U.S. relations with Poland, but also personally because I had the opportunity to live there and make so many friends several who are watching right now. I want to in the beginning, I want to thank a few people and pass it on and get this program going. And but this wouldn't have happened if my friend who I met in Warsaw, Zuzana, who is on the panel, who I connected with when she moved back to the States, was kind enough to say, sure, let's get involved. And the next thing you know, we have Ambassador Fried involved, and we have the Consul General from Houston involved. And of course, we have Candace involved, who we will all meet shortly. So I want to thank a few people before introducing Candace. Of course, this wouldn't have happened without the support of the Polish Investment and Trade Agency. And we want to thank the Atlantic Council for allowing us to borrow Dr. Fried. We appreciate what the council does around the country and world. We also really appreciate Dr. Jim Mazurkiewicz, who is at Texas A&M College Station. I know he goes by Dr. Jim, and I completely understand since I can relate having a very difficult last name. But Dr. Jim, we appreciate him for spreading the good word about our programming and helping us get more exposure with the Polish American Council of Texas. We also have several friends tuning in from Poland. So this is truly an international program, as well as friends from the Polish American Freedom Foundation, University of Houston Downtown, University of Texas, University of Incarnate Word. We also have companies who've been promoting us on their social media, like Polarin, as well as others, including our friends at U.S. Bank. And we also have several people from the embassy in D.C. tuning in. We want to thank the Honorable Piotr Wilczek, who is tuning in with some of his colleagues. So thank you, Ambassador, for joining us, as well as Nathan Cohen with Texas Public Radio for tuning in. So thank you all for tuning into this live segment. If you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A. Share your experiences about Poland and wherever you are in the chat room. And without further interruption, I'm going to introduce everyone to our moderator, Dr. Candace TenBrink. She's an assistant professor of management at the University of Houston Downtown, and her research interests include the strategic aspects of turnarounds, innovation, and life cycle issues. She was a Fulbright scholar in Poland, researching corporate rejuvenation and innovation. And prior to that, she was a managing partner of a film production firm and an award-winning analyst in investment banking. She's received her PhD from the Bauer School at U of H, an MBA from the Ross School of Business, and she is also a product of the Michigan State University. She's a Spartan, and I didn't realize that. So we really are fortunate to have this esteemed group of friends and colleagues from around the world and who will share their experiences. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Candace TenBrink, who will take it away. Thank you so much.
Armin, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm smiling here like a fool because whenever I hear my bio, I'm always like, wow, I must be old. And I never think I'm old. So anyway, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day to learn more about U.S. and Poland relations. And before we get started, let me also add to the long list of thank yous, a special thank you to Armin and Samantha behind the scenes at the World Affairs Council of San Antonio for producing this event, which I hope is going to be absolutely wonderful. So before we get started with the panelist introductions, which I'm sure you're waiting for, I want to give you a little bit of a layout. So I will introduce our panelists. Then we will have a moderated discussion about U.S. and Poland relations. And then after that, we will open it up for a Q&A time. And as Armin said, please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat and they will be fed to me and we'll move through this. We should finish around 12:25 or 12:30. So again, thank you for being here. So let me go ahead and start with the introductions. So first up, we have Robert Rusiecki. He is the Polish Consul General in Houston. His previous appointments were the Consul General of the Republic of Poland in London and Deputy Consul General / Acting Consul General of the Republic of Poland in Chicago. Prior to diplomatic service, he worked for Austrian, German, and Dutch financial institutions for several years. He is a graduate from Warsaw University, which of course is in Poland. Thank you so much for being here today, Consul Rusiecki.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.
Next up, we have Ambassador Daniel Fried. Currently, Ambassador Fried is the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He previously served in many important posts over the course of his 40-year foreign service career, including Ambassador to Poland, Special Assistant and NCS Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and State Department Quarter for Sanctions Policy. Thank you very much, Ambassador Fried, for joining us today. And last but not least, we have Zuzanna Kobryński. Zuzanna is the head of the Polish Investment and Trade Agency office in Houston, which is part of a network of 6 US-based offices. Her office covers 7 states. The agency's mission is to help Polish entrepreneurs expand their footprint into the US market and to encourage the flow of FDI in Poland. Prior to joining the agency, she ran the innovation program for the American Chamber of Commerce in Poland, started a Polish-based foundation to teach girls to code, was the assistant director of NYU's Center of the Cold War and the United States. And then she also ran the editorial office of Slate magazine. And then there's more. She was infected by the startup bug working at IAC under the likes of the CEO of Uber, and Julius Janakowski, noted investor and President Obama's FCC chairman. Zuzanna completed her undergraduate and graduate studies at NYU. Thank you, Zuzanna, for being here today.
Thank you, my pleasure. I'll make note to cut down my bio a little bit.
I love your bio, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. Okay, so here we go with the questions. The questions will be, we will rotate around and we will start off with Ambassador Fried. So Ambassador Fried, given your long-standing career with the State Department, and in particular, your time as ambassador to Poland, what were the biggest surprises you witnessed in Poland as it grew as a democracy? And what were the biggest challenges it faced as it began its post-communist relations with the United States?
The biggest surprise was how well the Poles did. I wasn't surprised, but I was practically the only one. People have forgotten how improbable it looked that communism would end in Poland or in Eastern Europe. And the Poles managed to do that. They led the way in 1989. Without the Polish democratic breakthrough that year, the Berlin Wall would not have fallen later. They led the way. And so that was the first seeming Polish miracle. The second was, after communism was overthrown, the question was, what are the Poles going to be able to do with the ruins, the wreckage of communism, both political and economic? And they made free market democracy work. And in one generation, Poland's economy tripled in size. It was a poor country, and by the mid-2000s, it was no longer a poor country. And that is a major achievement. But a third achievement is that Poland helped lead the way for the strategic achievement of a united Europe. NATO enlargement and EU enlargement would not have happened without Poland's success. They weren't the only ones, but they were the first. And they created the precedent for successful democracy and growing prosperity after communism was gone. That's a really big deal. Now, right now, there are a lot of issues that the United States and Poland have to tackle, and a lot of questions, and Polish politics is divided, sort of like like American politics is divided. But if you're going to look at U.S. Polish relations, you can start with how much good was achieved. This was a big deal, and it was my privilege and pleasure to be in Warsaw and working on U.S. Polish relations during many of those years. And it just worked out so well, which, considering the terrible history of the 20th century in Europe, was a miracle for which I am still in awe.
A quick follow-up on that, Ambassador Fried. Could you expound upon why you were not surprised, but others were?
Well, I was in 1989. I was the Polish desk officer at the State Department. That's not a high-level job, but it's one that allowed me to concentrate on what was happening in Poland every day. And I could see our embassy in Warsaw at the time was just wonderfully run and led. It was in touch with solidarity, and it was in touch with the government. And it was very clear to them, and therefore clear to me, the way this was going to end, which was basically solidarity negotiators got the communists to agree to what amounted to a referendum on communism in Poland with a Polish Pope in Rome. And when Poles voted again in every single contested seat, the communists lost. And I can talk about the details of that arrangement, but it was a national, it amounted to a national referendum, and Solidarity won because they were speaking for democracy and the Polish nation. And I was following it every day, so I wasn't surprised. But official Washington, no, they were completely skeptical. The first person in the incoming administration of George H.W. Bush who listened to me was then NSC Director Condoleezza Rice. She listened. She was willing to believe what was possible. We've been friends ever since. But that was a minority opinion. And then when I was in Poland in the early 1990s, when the economy was in terrible shape and the politics were divided, I kept thinking to myself, these people who managed to overthrow communism through a peaceful political process are going to fix the economy. They're going to do it. And I wasn't surprised when in 1992, the Polish economy turned around, and then they had basically 30 years of uninterrupted growth, big Chinese levels of growth, practically. But in Poland, it was through democracy. And I could see it because it seemed to me that the generation of liberation, the kind of Polish equivalent of the greatest generation, right? The generation of liberation in Poland, it seemed to me as an outsider, carried with them the legacy and the memory of every Polish democratic, patriotic uprising since 1795. And they would not let themselves fail. They didn't speak in such terms, but as an outsider, I could feel it. these people will not let themselves fail. And they succeeded in spectacular fashion. They weren't the only ones. The Balts, the Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians had similar success. And all of the countries of the former communist bloc in Eastern Europe have succeeded to greater or lesser degree. Only Yugoslavia failed, but Poland was the first. Somebody had to be first and show the way, and it was the Poles. So, I know that there are lots of problems and there were mistakes made and all the rest of it. I get that. But we have to remember how much good was done. And I'm still impressed by it to this day.
Thank you. The Consul Rusiecki, you have been stationed in London, Chicago, and now the San Antonio and Houston area under the consular flag. What are the biggest changes that you've seen over the years in terms of challenges and opportunities for the Polish community in these areas? And how has your role evolved over the years as our governments have evolved?
Thank you for that question. So it's a broad question. Well, London, Chicago, and San Antonio or Houston are really difficult to compare. Even if we take the Polish diaspora as a common denominator. Well, the Polish communities, or as we call them, Polonia, in those three centers have different origins and history. Each of those cities representing countries, states, has different significance for Polish communities and as well as Poland. For example, just cutting the long story short, because London, Chicago, Houston, they all deserve a separate university lecture. Speaking briefly, Great Britain and London was the main destination for Polish soldiers right after the Second World War. The Polish armed forces in the West constituted the fourth largest Allied army at the end of the war, after the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain. And there were almost 250,000 troops when the communists took over Poland, and Poland was part of the Soviet Union bloc. They decided not to go back, not to return to their homeland. And they stayed in Great Britain, and from Great Britain, some of them went to other destinations as well. The second big wave of, really big wave of immigration was when Poland joined the European Union in 2004. This was probably the largest one-time migration from Poland to another country. So London is really important because of the history and also because of the size of the Polish community there. Chicago is one of the most important Polish centers in the United States and Canada. If we compare, if we take into account both countries. And in Chicago, we have families who have lived there for generations. We have a large group of Polish soldiers of the Second World War and their descendants. We have a lot of people from the Solidarity movement and members of the democratic movement in Poland, and also a lot of economic migrants. Chicago is called the largest Polish city outside Poland, and there is a reason for that. And the state of Texas, I think it's a very special Polish Community Center because it's the actual cradle of Polish immigration to the United States. Not many people know that as early as 1854, the first permanent settlement was created in Panna Maria, Texas. And in a few years, there were other small towns created by Poles. A few years after the Panna Maria, which is in the vicinity of San Antonio, 2 years after Grzegorz Valley was the next wave of Polish immigrants. So at some point, there were so many Polish parishes in Texas that the number was bigger than the rest of the U.S. And it all happened decades before the big migration movement to the northern cities of the United States and Canada. So they are really not easy to compare, and Polish communities differ. But probably when I want to discuss a change that I was witnessing the last few years, the biggest change is the process of shifting migration from America to the European Union. So as a result, we have fewer and fewer people who want to come and live in America. And it also causes some of the Polish centers to shrink or even disappear in the landscape of the continent of North America. Talking about opportunities, I think that now and also in the past, being elected to local authorities, state authorities, federal authorities has been greatly underestimated in the Polish community, and the benefits for the community were underestimated as well. So this has been an ongoing opportunity, but not very well fulfilled. And the role of the consul hasn't changed really much. Consuls are government officers and have their responsibilities. But when I look at the past 10 years, I think that Polish community and diplomatic missions got really closer, and Polish diplomacy regained trust of the community, because it's worth mentioning that before 1989, before the system changed in Poland, consulates and embassies were not very well attended, and going for a passport or a visa was treated almost like a treason. And there was a really few people who were attending celebrations at the consulates. But it took years to change that, and this change has happened.
Okay, thank you very much. Susanna, you are up. In terms of Polish citizens engaging in business in the United States and specifically in Texas, what are the biggest challenges for entering the U.S. market? At what stage do you find firms wanting to enter, for example, young startup or seasoned firms? And how do you support those needs?
Candace, thank you for that question. So the 5 challenges that I've identified with my colleague, Paulina Mieczkowska-Wykon, who works with me in my Houston office, and I won't speak about my other colleagues in other offices if they've identified these, But the first one is product market fit. Is the product right for the United States? They may have a general idea. Well, say we're talking, shampoo or something that might be selling in Poland. Well, is there a market for that type of shampoo in the United States? And we help them kind of refine what are the market trends, do some market research for these companies, and kind of guide them along that process of finding out whether there's a really good product market fit for what they do. Communication styles. I don't know, Candace, if you noticed this or picked this up when you were in Poland, but there is a definite marked difference between how Poles communicate and how Americans communicate. And so what we do as, being from the United States is also help them with pointers or kind of helpful advice to bring about an awareness that there is a different communication style. Cultural differences as well. There are cultural differences that companies face when they're looking to launch in the United States. And again, we help walk them through that. Distance and time. There is a 7-hour distance between Poland and Texas. And so that's why we're here on the ground, we're embedded where there are boots on the ground to help solve a number of different issues that they're facing. Because of that time difference, we can be helpful that way. And then, finally, finding the right partners. When you are considering entering a market that's thousands of miles away, what are you going to do? Go into Google and, look for a distributor? You can't verify them very well. And so we guide them through that process. So, and we work with generally SMEs. So, all of those challenges, that's time, talent, treasure for SMEs that they don't have. And again, we are the boots on the ground that can help these companies go through that process.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Ambassador Freed, I'm sure everyone's waiting for this question. How do you think Biden's presidency will impact our relationship, ours as in U.S. and Poland, of course? And in what ways may that be beneficial or challenging?
President Biden has a track record of cooperation with and support for Poland. In the 1990s, as a senator, he supported Poland's entry into NATO. I was working on that issue in the Clinton White House, and we needed Democrats and wasn't sure how they were going to come out on this. And he was strong. He was for it. Tony Blinken, now the Secretary of State, was my colleague and ally on this issue because he was a speechwriter in the Clinton National Security Council staff, and we worked together on the NATO enlargement question, which was the #1 question for Poland at the time, because it meant that their security from Kremlin aggression would be locked in. So this was a big deal, and President Biden and Secretary Blinken have track records of work with and support for Poland. So Poland is an unknown territory for the president and Tony Blinken. They are going to want to, I suspect they're going to want to work with Poland, especially on so-called Eastern questions, that is, dealing with Putin's aggression, supporting Ukraine's independence and reforms, support for Belarus democracy, energy independence, and strengthening NATO. So that's a big positive agenda. I also suspect, and I've been hearing from people in the Polish government lead me to believe, that the Biden administration and Poland will have similar views on how the West needs to approach China. Now, so these are all good things. This is a positive agenda. It's a good one. The challenge will be politics in both countries. Okay, American politics is divided, and there is a kind of isolationist, neo-isolationist movement, somewhat on the right, somewhat on the left. And clearly, the Biden administration is aware of this, which is why they keep talking about a foreign policy brings benefits for Americans. And in Poland, as I said earlier, politics is also divided and polarized. And it's sort of similar to the way it is here, with the opposition party and the governing party in Poland pretty much at odds on a whole lot of stuff. And that division in Polish politics has led to some questions in the West and the United States, pressure on Polish media that is seen as critical of the government, or reforms of the judiciary that have raised questions about judicial independence. So those are going to be issues. But there is a positive, there are issues in both countries, but there's also, I think, leadership that wants to make this work. And by the way, Polish politics is divided, but the liberal opposition in Poland, and I know a lot of those people, supports a strong U.S.-Polish relationship and supports U.S.-Polish cooperation on all the things I laid out earlier. So there's a consensus in Poland that we can work with. My last point is democracy and the rule of law have been the foundations of the U.S.-Polish relationship. And the Poles, back in the 1970s, in the communist period, the Polish democratic dissidents were arguing then that the United States just couldn't look at the Soviet Union. We had to remember freedom in Poland. And they were right. They were absolutely right. So values and common democratic values are what makes the relationship. And that goes back, that actually goes back a long way. I mean, to the American Revolution, when a Polish nobleman and officer probably saved the American continental forces against the British at Saratoga. That was Tadeusz Kościuszko. And he also believed, well, why did he support American freedom and independence? Because he believed in the indivisibility of freedom. Freedom for the Americas was good for Poland. He was right too. So we have this tradition, and it's a good one, of understanding that our patriotic national interests are bound up with universal values. And that's going to drive the relationship forward.
Thank you for that. Consul Rusiecki, you spend a lot of time communicating with Polish and Polish American citizens and organizations in your consular jurisdiction. What type of support are they seeking, and how do you engage and assist them? And if you feel comfortable answering the second part of the question, how has the grassroots sea of nationalism impacted your community in San Antonio and beyond?
I would like to start saying that, especially in communist times, but even earlier, Polish Americans were a great help for Poland. They were lobbying for NATO membership, and they were helping in numerous various ways. Polish communities in Poland, their families, and they were a good advocate for Polish matters. So now, after the 1989, the roles have changed a bit, and we can pay back. We can cooperate with Polish American communities in the United States, and we can create various groups together. Polish American organizations, individual leaders, they learned that consulates, embassies, can be a great help for them in achieving their goals. It may relate to regular activities or some very special projects. happy to be of assistance to support those efforts. And more and more often, we've achieved very great results in that cooperation. And in many cases, the cooperation with Polish communities in the United States have extended to many American entities. And this cooperation has been very fruitful. It ranged from art festivals like music theater, cinema, to business projects, to defense projects, and to research and scientific projects. So for example, not long ago, there's been established a cooperation between MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston and Polish Ministry of Health. It was witnessed, the signing of agreement was witnessed by the President of Poland in 2019. And without Polish community's support, without involvement of Polish leaders in the United States, this wouldn't probably happen. So the cooperation between diplomatic missions and the Polish communities across the country has been growing really dynamically. What I also noticed is that Polonia or Polish communities have become much more involved in an active role in what is going on in Poland. So, and to support that, I can say that the number of people voting in Polish parliamentary presidential election has been growing over the years. So it's another factor that proves growing involvement of the community into whatever is happening in Poland. With regards to nationalism, if I understood the question well, in our consular jurisdiction, I haven't noticed a single example of nationalistic behavior, but I think it's a very interesting issue, and it cannot be analyzed in a superficial or inaccurate manner. I'm not talking now about Polish communities. I'm talking about any community, actually. So it has to be deeply analyzed and understood, because it's very easy these days. It's very easy to confuse nationalism with patriotism. Patriotism is nowadays not very much in fashion across the globe. So when we analyze certain social behaviors, we still need to go back to the virtue and to the value of patriotism, to distinguish it, to be able to distinguish it from pure nationalism. Patriotism needs to be recognized. Nationalism needs to be strongly opposed.
Thank you so much for that. We have about 10 more minutes, and I'd like to offer a follow-up, but then I have Susanna's last question. And the follow-up is for Ambassador Fried or Susanna. Have you seen nationalism impact constituents or politics in terms of U.S. Poland relations? What would be your take on this?
I agree with Consul General Rusiecki that there is a difference between nationalism and patriotism. The current Polish government is conservative, including on social issues. Abortion, LGBTQ rights. And there have been a lot of demonstrations in Poland protesting that. In issues, but there are, in issues like Polish-Ukrainian relations, Polish policy, as I see it as an outsider, is not dominated by nationalism. Polish-Ukrainian relations are complicated. There's a lot of good history, there's a lot of bad history. And the Polish position in support of Ukraine's independence is not dominated by a nationalist agenda. It is supportive of Ukraine, and they have the issues, particularly historical issues that divide Ukrainians and Poles, do not dominate the Polish government's general support for Ukrainian independence. And that seems to have a lot of support, and that positive agenda seems to have a lot of support in Polish society. And that's important. That's important because you can't say the same for all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe who look at Ukraine. I don't want to have to happily, I don't have to go into that now. But there are a lot of hot button historical issues that can generate a lot of intense feelings in Poland. But generally speaking, since 1989, Poland has been governed by what Americans call its better angels. And that's important to remember. I mean, we Americans know all about hot button historical issues. We're fighting about that right now. You know, Confederate statues and the failure of Reconstruction in the 1870s. So like, all countries have this. All countries have histories that they have to deal with. The issues of patriotism and nationalism are something that all democracies work with and sometimes struggle with. But the Polish policy has not been captured, generally speaking, by this in its relations with its eastern neighbors like Lithuania and Belarus and Poland. And that's important and that's good. So there's plenty to say about the issues that divide Poles, but we all have our issues. All countries have their issues.
Thank you for the follow-up. Zuzanna, I would like to ask you this. So when I was living in Poland and conducting my research, I noticed that freedom and passion, sorry about that, that was my dog going crazy. So I noticed that freedom and passion to self-direct one's destiny were fundamental with all entrepreneurs with which I spoke. I actually found it more pronounced than here in the United States. So how do you harness and grow this embedded passion and zeal while meeting the realities that the U.S. market, which of course is very tough to enter due to institutional structure, isomorphic pressures, and policy changes? How do you deal with that?
So I think why you found that difference, I think there's two reasons for it. One, I think innovation, entrepreneurialism is in the DNA of the Polish people. When you're at the mercy of historical forces, you need to innovate. You need to be entrepreneurial. Two, I think government assistance, government programming to push innovation, push entrepreneurialism. Our agency is a prime example of that. You know, whether it's workshops for Polish entrepreneurs. Again, when we're talking about early stage SMEs, right, who need that help. So whether it's workshops, whether it's programming, whether it's working with the offices around the world, and we have 60 offices around the world. So, you know, if they are interested in exploring the market in Egypt, we have an office there that can help them. Obviously, in the United States, as I mentioned, you know, there's 6 offices in general. And so, you know, how we work with them is, again, helping them find the right places for their product, but it's also giving that support that is that's expensive for a company coming over and launching. So whether it's working out of our offices, there's funding for very early stage companies through a program called the Tech Bridges program. And so again, early stage companies, they get consulting on how to refine their market strategy. They get a grant of around $40,000 to use for traveling to the United States to explore that market entry. My agency is part of the Polish Development Fund. And so there are a couple of other agencies that also push this entrepreneurial, not push, but grow it, nurture it. There's PARP, so they primarily work with startups. And for example, they give companies the opportunities to attend trade shows. Going to a trade show is a huge cost for anyone. And so that's something that's alleviated, right? And that gives them access to a market. There's a agency within our umbrella organization that helps finance expansion to another country, to the US. So if you have a Polish company, you know, a medium-sized company that is into production and they're thinking of opening up a production plant in the United States, that's something that, you know, is assisted. We've had 2 success stories here in Texas of companies that have launched in the US. I'm really proud of that. A cosmetics company and an urban recycling company. And both had benefited not only through our programming, but through programming, excuse me, from those organizations underneath that umbrella.
Excellent, thank you. I have time for one last quick question before Q&A, and this is the question. Well, if we could have the answer be relatively short, we'll have more time for Q&A. How will the 3 Cs, a consortium of political cooperation among 12 European nations, engage with and support the growing demand for alternative energy?
I can try to take that. The 3 Cs initiative is a regional initiative that the Polish and Croatian presidents championed, and that the Trump administration supported, and the Biden administration supports. The Biden administration supports it. It's a good idea. The theory is that extra efforts are needed to come up with viable investment projects to fix the problem that during the communist period, infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe ran east to west only and didn't run north to south, and the area wasn't integrated well with itself. And this is, you know, if you're trying to do business between Poland and Romania, you have to fly through Vienna or Central Europe. And the road network doesn't work, and energy infrastructure isn't established. So the 3 Cs initiative tries to alleviate those problems, and it's actually reasonable. It has a reasonable prospect of success. As I said, the Biden administration supports it. The U.S. ambassador to Poland during the Trump administration, who was fabulous, Georgette Mossbacher, skilled, capable, is going to continue to support the 3 Cs initiative. So there's something to this. It also needs to be made compatible with the European Union, because they're doing a lot of these things too. So it all needs to be knit up, because we want the goal is to make Central and Eastern Europe and Poland an integrated part of a united Europe, not some kind of backwater. And you have to build the infrastructure to make it work. And that has to make business sense. I mean, Pani Susanna has to be comfortable with that, you know, an entrepreneur, someone who understands business. It can't be charity. It's got to make business sense. So it's on the U.S. Polish agenda. And it's interesting that the Trump administration supported it and the Biden people didn't reject it for political reasons, which would have been dumb. They accepted it, which means they're thinking seriously and not just kind of in a partisan way rejecting everything Trump did.
Thank you. I have now it's Q&A, so I have a question from Nathan Silverstein.
Candace, I'm sorry, I had a follow-up question for Ambassador Fried. No. Since he lived through this portion of history, I know that with the 3 Cs initiative, there is an investment fund that's tied to it. And we all know the miracle that the Polish American Enterprise Fund that came about, you know, in the late 80s and what that did. Does he see a similar effect with this investment fund through the 3 Cs initiative, or are we talking about, you know, apples and oranges?
Look, I am a huge fan of the Polish American Enterprise Fund. In fact, I helped write the original concept paper for it back in the spring of 1989. So, I love it.
I wasn't paid to ask that question.
Its successor is the Polish American Freedom Foundation, which is doing good work. These are different things, but the idea, sort of the core concept of having governments support an entrepreneurial initiative to encourage projects and money is something that can work. I mean, that the Enterprise Fund proved the concept, at least in Poland. It wasn't successful everywhere, but it sure was in Poland. So that the idea is bring together regional projects that aren't dependent on single countries and benefit the whole region and benefit a united Europe. It's got to work for the European Union. And for all of the countries of the region. So there's something to this project, and I hope it grows.
So as a good moderator, I'm supposed to check in with our host. So Armin, we're almost to our cutoff time, and I wanted to ask you specifically if we do have time for one question from the audience, or if we will close it.
Absolutely. I think you started Nathan's question, so why don't we go and ask that?
Great, and I think it's wonderful because Nathan is a student from UT Austin, and he's the founder and president of the Polish Club. So I'm super thrilled to be asking a student's question. So here's the question: what is Poland doing to help facilitate democratization in Belarus?
I can actually answer some of that. The Belarus democratic movement, the people who are protesting the presidential elections that the dictator of Belarus tried to steal, had to leave Belarus, and they're political exiles in a lot of them in Vilnius in Lithuania and a lot of them in Warsaw. And Poland has been a champion of Belarus democracy for a number of years. And right now it is helping these people. It's going to be a long struggle for Belarus democracy. It's not going to be easy. I wish it were. But that kind of determination that the Belarusian democratic movement is showing has to be respected. It reminds me a little bit of Poland after the first solidarity after 1981, after martial law. It will take a while, but they can succeed. And Poland is helping.
Armin, if I may, thank you, panelists, for being wonderful and making my job look easy.
And I think with respect to the people who are tuning in from all over the world, I'm going to cut my part short and ask a question from London. And question comes from Konrad Zielinski, who's Deputy Director of Polish Cultural Institute in London. There are cultural similarities between Polish and American societies. How should cultural entities from both countries approach them to further strengthen mutual understanding and forge closer cultural relations? And if one person could just respond, that'd be great.
Obviously there are differences between Polish culture and American culture, and if we try to understand the American culture, we'll immediately be faced with hundreds of different genres and traditions forming the culture of a particular region. But going to the roots of our, let's say, Indo-European culture, America was colonized by Europeans in the first decades. So they brought the culture with them. So if you go to the Appalachian Mountains, you'll hear Welsh, Irish, English tunes known 200, 300 years ago. And this is the good foundation to bring things together. The other thing that will help bringing different cultures together is openness of Poles for foreign cultures, and openness of Americans, Texans, Wisconsinians for various cultures of the world. So I wouldn't see any obstacle in bringing those various cultural worlds together. And when we return to the times that we have known much better than last year, and there will be again number of cultural offerings everywhere. We will all see how world music and different music from different sides of the world will come together, and music and also some other forms of art.
Can I jump in here for a second? I think there's a huge a boost of the identity of the Polish brand in America by the gaming sector, especially with games like The Witcher, Cyberpunk, but especially after The Witcher came out. I think that exposed a whole generation of Americans to the story of The Witcher, who then they went to go read the book, right? And then the next Netflix series came out. So I think there's a lot to be said. People think it's, well, it's kind of frivolous, right? It's just a game or something. But I think that can bring, that's brought a lot of attention into American society about Poland, which only leads to further exploration, right? And further connections that we can make.
Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. And people have stayed tuned. We haven't had too many people drop off because this has been such a great discussion about such a wonderful relationship and a great country that I highly recommend everyone to visit or do business with or even live in. So we will share everyone's contact that you see on the screen. If I know David had a question and a few others had questions. So we will share their contacts with everyone who registered, and they'd be happy to entertain any other questions or comments you may have. Very much appreciate Dr. Candace TenBrink for moderating, for stepping up to do this. I really appreciate you for taking on the questions and for also including your students into this into the program. Mr. Consul General, thank you so very much for representing the Republic of Poland. Appreciate that. Ambassador Fried, thank you for taking time to be with us, and also the Atlantic Council. And Susanna, appreciate you for just your overall enthusiasm and working with us, and also your colleague Polina at the Polish Investment and Trade Agency. So thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. And before we sign off, Sex and World Peace. That is our first book that we will be discussing in book club later this month. So Samantha is spearheading the book club, which is starting this month. If you want to register for that, we will have a great discussion about that. The International Citizen of the Year, we are looking at sponsors. We've got many of you supporting, and we still need some sponsors. So we are honoring Dr. Larry Schlesinger from Texas Biomed, and also Dr. Larry Broom from Harvard is our keynote speaker. And of course, if you would like to support the World Affairs Council, we would very much appreciate it. There's a link to do that and get involved. Thank you so much, panel. Thank you for your time. I hope everyone learned something. And thank you, Samantha, for handling all the logistics in the background. And do widzenia. No, how do you say goodbye?
Do widzenia.
Do widzenia. And maybe we could gather again and have some pivo later, right?
You're buying, Armin.
Absolutely. I have a few zlotys left, so.
Bye. Nice seeing everyone. Thank
Do
you,
widzenia.
everyone. This was a pleasure.
Thank you.